Hey everybody, I'm Jess. I work at Twitter as a developer advocate. Anna interned on my team over the summer and was like, Jess, you should come and speak. And I was like, okay, cool. And today I'm going to talk with y'all about working with APIs. This is basically the talk that I wish that I had when I was getting started. It kind of started as like the things I learned the hard way and then has turned into a talk about APIs, which is my favorite thing. I work on APIs. I talk about them. I help people use them. Really love working with APIs. And I think working with APIs is where I found like the magic of like working with code. So hopefully, yeah, y'all will be able to learn some things about APIs. I know that we have some people from different backgrounds, so this will be a little bit of an interactive presentation. But before I get too deep into things, I'm going to introduce myself, Jessica Garson. My pronouns are she, they, and I'm a developer advocate on the team. And you'd be wondering, like, what is a developer advocate? Like, I think I've seen that around. Like, what is that? Like, what do you do? I get to talk with groups just like this one about the Twitter API or APIs in general. And I also spend a lot of time building tutorials, working with our APIs, helping people use our APIs, supporting our APIs on the forums, which we have some Twitter developer community forums, and also having one-on-one conversations with developers, speaking to groups of developers, hosting office hours, Twitch streams, speaking at conferences back in the day, now virtual events such as this one, just getting to know our developer community. I also live in New York City, so you might hear some like weird noises. Right now, there's someone blasting music behind me. That happens. Yay for living in New York. And my Twitter handle is @Jessica Garson. It's actually like important to note, and I actually will talk about this a few times, is I actually, when I was in college, I did not go to college for computer science. I went for political science. I wanted to be a campaign manager. That was my goal. And I was going down that pathway until one day some messy data came into my life and I had to write some code to make it less messy. And I did it. And it really challenged all of the assumptions I had about myself, where I was like, oh my God, like never thought of myself as a technical person, but I Googled and made some code work. Oh my God, this is so awesome. And I was about 28 when that happened, actually, to age myself a little bit. And ever since then, I've kind of been chasing that feeling of like, oh my God, my code work. This is great. This is so awesome. And I was working with APIs. So fell in love with like writing code at that moment and then learned how to code more deeply through a community program in Washington, DC that used to exist called Hear Me Code, which was free, beginner-friendly conversations for women by women. So yeah, that's a little bit about how I got started. And then as soon as I started learning, I started teaching others and became an engineer at a couple of different places and felt like something was missing, quit my job, started teaching at NYU. Pretty quickly thereafter was like, oh my God, like I really like planning hackathons. I really like speaking at conferences. I really like writing code for an audience. I have a hobby where I write code that makes music and I perform all over. I used to be DIY clubs in New York City. So I just really like writing code for other people to see. And yeah, some people are talking about the moment when the code finally works and makes the errors worth it. And I think that's sort of what I help people do. So that's a little bit about myself. Yeah, thank you so much for having me here. I'm really excited to talk to you all. And today we're going to be talking about what are APIs, what I can build with APIs, how do I work with them, and then I'm going to run a Jupyter notebook and show y'all an example using the Twitter API. For those who don't know, API is the acronym for Application Programming Interface. And you might be wondering, like, so what is that? You're using them all the time. APIs are everywhere. We use them all day, every day right now. I can think of a couple that we're using. We're using the Google Slides API. We're using the Zoom API, especially to make today happen. And we're probably using a whole host of other APIs. We use them all the time, all day, every day, we're using APIs. So whenever you get your email on your phone or when your calendar is synced based on an email, all of that is because of APIs, which is so awesome. And they're basically a way for two programs to kind of share information with each other. And typically they're used to perform an action of some sort. And they're basically how computers talk to each other. And so, yeah, the term API typically refers to a group of hosted web services that you can extend or add some useful service or content to an app that you're building or some code that you're writing. One of the things that really kind of confused me a little bit was the difference between APIs and data sets. That was, to me, the thing that I was like, what is the difference? What is this? I don't understand. Especially because like some data sets like the census are data sets that have APIs. And I was like, wait, what? And I've actually been working a lot with Swagger too. So I hope to talk with y'all offline about that. And then for an advanced software engineering class, some of y'all are making a web service with an API, and you can make your own APIs. That is something that I love to do. You could definitely do that. But yeah, I was at first like super confused between APIs and data sets. I mean, APIs are a live connection to the resource. So if the information changes, you get the latest. Sets are static, they're unchanging. They're typically like a CSV or some sort of like database dump. And if things change, then you're out of date. And so APIs are more of like that live, reoccurring, refreshing service that you would use to kind of get the latest. Another thing that really confused me when I was first getting started, and I told some of y'all in a pre-call for this, just a funny story about when I was applying for jobs and didn't realize that I was using SDKs, is the difference between APIs and SDKs. SDK is an acronym for Software Development Kit. Well, software development kits are basically like a branded API or a collection of development tools in one installable package. So for me, my programming language of choice is Python. And so the package installer for Python is pip. So if I wanted to install Twilio, which is an SMS API that lets you send text messages. So if I wanted to do pip install Twilio, I would get a bunch of like branded Twilio hooks that I can use to extend into my service. So it's basically like a packaged API. So you'd be wondering, like, what can be built with APIs? Some of y'all were saying that you've used it to extend a web service. I could tell you a couple of things that I've built really quickly. I built a way to interact with my weird live coded music so that you could tweet at me and it gets into my songs, which is really cool. I built a way for me to solve my parking problem that I was having in New York City. I park on the street and there's alternate side of the street parking regulations, and I was moving my car too much. So I built, using Twitter data, a way to get a text message every time I don't have to move my car. So especially in weather situations, it can be really helpful. And for any idea that you have, there's probably an API for it. For example, I learned recently from my coworkers who really are into fish about the fish API. I was told that I should use it today for the demo, but I don't think we're going to do that. But there's a fish API. There is a Pokemon API. There's a metal API I've seen. And there's even this API directory, which has all different sorts of crazy things. Typically, for anything that you're thinking of, there's an API for it. So let's just go to a random page. There's so many different, there's a Fitbit API. There's so many different APIs. There's even still a MySpace API. Really, for any idea that you have, you can use it. And somebody asked, have I used any APIs for personal use? Yeah, I actually use, so the demo that I'm going to be giving later, I actually was using a version of it for my own personal usage of like to get things from tweets that I was saving into a Google Sheet to remind me who to follow up with after conferences and things like that. So I'll be showing that in a bit. And yes, MySpace, that was a time back in the day. So yeah, for any idea that you have, there's probably an API. So Rowdy Hacks is coming up, and ICPC also. And I don't know who's going to win Rowdy Hacks, but I know that probably the winner is going to be something using an API plus another API, or an API plus a cool data set, right? It's going to involve an API of some sort. And someone once told me before my first hackathon, a secret, which is the secret to a cool project is an API plus another API. Hopefully I'm not like spilling the beans on anything, but that is typically what makes a good project. So you might be wondering, like, so how do you even start working with them? Like, what do you do? Like, how do we get started? Like, I want to work with APIs right now. How can I do that? So let's go to a club. I haven't been to a club in a while, right? Has anybody been to a club recently? I hope nobody has in the past year. Cool. So I miss going to the club. I live in New York City. I like clubs, good times. And I like to think of working with an API kind of like going to a club. So except for we're going to go to like a real secret club that you need like a secret handshake to get into. And that's like how you authenticate, right? We pass in our secret handshake, and then we can go to the bar to make requests, like to get things. I did this with my students, and I actually set up a bar and like printed out documentation for all of them to work with. I don't think they were super pleased with it, but I made them before they can get the soda and snacks I had at the bar. They had to say that they were going to get the snacks, and if they needed to put something anywhere, they would have to like make a post request. Yeah, so that's sort of the way that my mental model works about thinking of working with APIs. The way that I like to think about it is OAuth is the bouncer. So you might be like, what is OAuth? What is that? Like, I've never heard of that. So OAuth is typically how you authenticate to an API, and it basically is a protocol to allow secure authorization, or the secret handshake that gets you into the club, right? That's sort of like how I like to think about it. And I sent the OAuth webpage around. It's really helpful. Actually, I do recommend watching this video. I watched it a few times. It's real fun. So if you have some spare time or want to like learn more about it, OAuth is typically how you do authenticate to APIs. Cool. So yeah, OAuth is the bouncer. That's a good way of thinking of it. And so typically APIs use what's known as REST protocol. And you might be wondering, like, what? REST? Like, what is that? It stands for representational state transfer, but you're like, wait, what? Like, what is representational state transfer? I don't know what that is. And someone says these, which, yeah, representational state transfer is kind of hard to explain. But the way that I like to think about it is a service that allows you to interact with a web service the same way that you would interact with HTTP. So it's basically the same way that, like, when we visit a web page, we're making an HTTP request. When we hit an API, we're doing the same thing. So there are a couple of other types of like related types of APIs that come up. There's webhooks. So typically with REST in particular, it's used to make requests. And we'll talk about the different types of requests, but typically you ask for something and then it gives you the resource. With webhooks, it's like signal, it's like the reverse. So it's like signals that you can send to your application anytime like the state of something changes. So typically with APIs, I'm like, hey, I want this, I want that, here's what I want. With webhooks, it's like, and we use this for our account activity API, like anytime that, like, let's say we were watching Twitter Dev or watching my own Twitter handle, Jessica Garson, every time that like I posted a new tweet, you'd get my account activity. If I allowed you to have that sort of access to my account, you would learn everything that I do on the service, and I would send a signal every time that that changes. There's also streaming. The Twitter API has the most popular streaming service, and it's basically a real-time connection. So I can actually show an example of this later if folks want to see, but it basically will stream real-time tweets as they happen. We actually have one endpoint called sampled stream that shows 1% of the public conversation. I'm always nervous to show it in demos because I'm afraid of what 1% of the public conversation looks like. And I'm like so nervous it's going to be inappropriate. But if you all really want, like, we could probably do a filtered version or something like that. But yeah, that will give you like results that match a keyword using our filter stream endpoint, or all the results of 1% of the public conversation if you really want that happening as they go streaming around it. So yeah, and then there's a newer thing that's kind of come up that I think is really awesome, which is GraphQL, which we internally use at Twitter for making our internal APIs. And it's a query language for APIs, similar to like SQL. Like when you make requests with SQL, you ask for things and you build a query. It's a query language for APIs and a runtime for fulfilling those queries to allow you to get your existing data in a more like SQL type, like querying, asking for different things in different ways sort of way. And so this allows you to work with interconnected data in a really robust way too. So that's also, I think, something that's pretty cool. There's a couple of different tools to work with APIs. So curl is a command line tool to work with APIs. I can show y'all how it works. I'm sure everyone, okay, so yeah, someone wants to see your curl request, rad. So before you can use the Twitter API in particular, you have to apply for access. And here's a step-by-step guide to like making your first request, which I will also make. I don't think I dropped this in the chat, but yeah, so you'd also, and here's like sort of a step-by-step guide to getting like your bearer token and everything set up. And so from here, what we can do, so let's do the timelines API. So let's go to Twitter API. Actually, here, I had the page pulled up. So from here, if we go to the quick start, or actually the API reference page, it was actually pulled up to the right place. Let's do this tweets. And we're going to get all the tweets for Twitter Dev. And we're going to be working with this example a few times. But let's say we wanted to get all the fields possibly available from the Timelines API. And the Timelines API will get the last 3,200 tweets from a user. So we're going to get, for my team's Twitter handle, which is Twitter Dev, we're going to get their last 3,200 tweets. So now from here, I'm going to cut and paste that into my terminal, which is here. And from here, we're going to get the last 3,200 tweets in JSON. And you're like, wow, okay, cool. I've gotten some data. It's a great way for testing. You also notice that I was able to just cut and paste that, and that's because I had my bearer token exported in before because I didn't want to show you all any secrets. And so from here, how to do that is I do this one line of export bearer token equals your bearer token, which is not what my bearer token is, but that would be what your bearer token is. And therefore, I can run all this code without having to show you all my secrets, which is good. And Gabe said that they used, the curl is used in system. Cool, awesome. So yeah, that's one way that you can connect to APIs. I use it for just like testing a lot of times as I go. And then there's what's known as REST clients, which are Postman or Insomnia. I think there's a couple more ones. I think there's even something called Postwoman. Like there's a couple of ones. I use Postman typically, but there are different ones for different jobs, and some, you know, a lot of it's just personal preference. I love Postman because it's a graphical interface that lets me kind of work with an API. The main difference for me, at least, is preference. So yeah, do you want to make another request using Postman? We have a Postman collection. So from here, this one is just going to get the tweets, and then you can actually start to like adjust things. So let's say if you wanted to do these tweet fields, we can actually start to adjust it from here. And we could send the request and we get the JSON back, which is really cool. So we can start to kind of like play around. Also, we've moved to this like what you ask is what you get payload structure, which means that like being able to see the payload is really important as you're like making changes, because if you don't get the right URL correct or select the right fields, and you won't get the fields back. And one of the times, like when we first launched is that when I was working with the API, I did a bunch of like natural language processing to get the language of tweets, forgetting that you can that we had a field for that. Because I was like, I'm a Twitter API expert. I don't need to look at the documentation, which is not true. I do need to look at the documentation. So yeah, so that's pretty cool. And I love working with Postman. And then the other cool kind of secret that I sometimes use is if you click where it says code, you can actually start to generate like the starting point of some sample code. And not all of it works, but I find it sometimes like a really good starting point to kind of like, especially if you're working on a hackathon or you're like just getting started on something, it's pretty cool to like work with the auto-generated one as well. Sometimes there are, though, to be honest, like different parameters that don't look as polished, like it'll do straight the URL and not necessarily like choosing params for Python and things like that. But it is a good starting point, especially if you're trying to build something really quickly. Cool. Yeah, so that's a little bit about Postman. And then there's also libraries that are like request helpers that you can use. And there's one for pretty much every language. For Python these days, I mostly use the request package, and we're going to use that today. And then for PHP, it's also called requests. There's another package that's not the same package. For Ruby, there's HTTP party, which is personally my favorite title of a library ever, I think, or HTTP party. And then for Node.js, there's Axiom. And today we're going to be doing an example with the request Python package. And the data that you get back is mostly going to be JSON or XML. I showed you all what some JSON looks like. So it's pretty fun. And then there's some methods that you need to think about. So let's say you wanted to get tweets from the past 7 days, you would do a GET request. And we use that with like the recent search endpoint. We're going to make a GET request. Oh, we've already made 2 GET requests already. And then there is post, which is when you post a tweet. We use obviously the post endpoint. Put or patch, this is used for editing. We have something called hide replies, which is an endpoint that uses this, which will get rid of like replies that you don't want people to see. And then there's also the delete method, which you would use for deleting a tweet. And then there's different statuses that you'll get back as well. So there's 100 level, which is like great. That's for like, you know, information. 200 is like what you always want to see, successful. We had 200 level requests today, which is super fun. 3, which is for redirection, or 300. 400, which is for client error, which I never want to see because that means that there's something wrong with my code. And then there's 500 level for server errors and things like that. So if you're getting a 500 errors, probably Twitter's fault if you're using the Twitter API. So today we'll be using the Google Sheets API and the Twitter API to send our JSON payload to Google Sheets. I like working with this because you can actually like kind of like see the payload as it changes. And this is like what I always love to do for my like demos just because you could kind of see things change super quickly. So I'm going to make this a little bit bigger just so y'all could see it. So from here, we're going to start to import in, and I'm writing code in Python. Also, before we get to this, I meant to show you, I'm using Jupyter Notebooks just so that you can kind of see the input and output as well. So I'll share all of these links again at the end of this as well. But this kind of goes through the basic steps for running a Jupyter Notebook. But I have one set up already for the demo just because I like to be prepared. So the first thing that we'd want to do is import pandas. I don't like to type out pandas all the time, so I always do import pandas as PD, import gspread. Gspread is a community package that's a community SDK that lets you connect to the Google API. And then there's OS, which is for operating system. That's going to help us work with environment variables so I don't show you all my secrets and that y'all could like take my Twitter API keys and make a million calls and like get my manager really upset with me. We use that because of, you know, we don't want everybody to see that. And then we're going to use request, which is that Python package that helps you make HTTP requests in Python. And somebody asked, like, I've heard of all of this except for Jupyter. Is this like just an online IDE? So Jupyter is used typically for data science type tasks. I like it for this because I could just run line by line and then I can like show y'all and you could see my like responses. And if I do print at any stage, you guys could see it and I could make changes. And I always find it like easier to work with this way, especially for showing you, but it is not online, it is local. Yeah, it's running through my local host and I've run it that way. And so I just type into my terminal Jupyter Notebook. I would type in for here, if I would go in here, I could just type in, let's go down here, I would just type in Jupyter Notebook and it would spin up a local environment for me, which is what I did right before. Or maybe we should have waited to show y'all, but it just spins up a kind of IDE type thing. And then from there, you can kind of start to play around with it. And so from here, you can import requests. And then from OAuth 2, we're going to be using service accounts, especially for the Google API. And service accounts basically let you create an account that you can share. And I'll show you some stuff in a little bit that will be kind of cool with Google Sheets. So from here, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to want to connect to the Twitter API. So I've created this function called connect to Twitter API. And I'm basically like, yo, operating system, can you get me that bearer token? And then from there, it will return the bearer token formatted into a Python dictionary so that the authorization is set to bearer and the bearer token. And then from here, I'm creating the headers, which I'm not going to show you because that would involve showing you my secret, but it basically creates this dictionary in Python. So from here, I have another function called make request, and I want to pass the request in. So from here, we have the URL, which is api.twitter.com/2 because we're using v2 of the Twitter API /users. That's our user endpoint. And then this is the user ID for Twitter dev. So I'm just going to go to Twitter. And I'm just going to get the tweets from Twitter dev. So Twitter dev. And then, yep, right here. And then we're just going to get the tweets from this. So from here, we're also going to pass in the params. So this is the tweet field, and we're going to pass in created at and lang. And then from here, we're going to return request.request with the URL. The headers, we want to be equal to headers, and the params, we want equal to params. And then we want this to be in JSON because that's going to be the data that we work with, right? So from here, we can make that. And then from here, we have this response. And then from here, we could actually do print response just to print it out to see our JSON. And we have a couple of different objects. We have data, which has the last 10 tweets from here. And then we have this meta that tells us like a little bit more about what's going on in there. So it says that the oldest ID for the tweet ID is this one, and then it has the newest and the result count, and then the next token, which I could use to show you more than 10 tweets. But I think for the purposes of today, we only want 10 tweets, right? And then also it's a parameter. So we could even, if we wanted to set max results inside of here to equal 100 or I think we have up to 100 according to the documentation. I can actually change that too. But for the purposes of today, let's just do 10. I typically will play around with getting the URL just right inside of Postman as like a way of kind of like changing that parameter and kind of playing with it. And so from here, I like things to be in a data frame. I like to like see things as like a spreadsheet. I don't know why. I just like to see tabular data. Like I just love it. It makes me so happy. So I have this function called make data frame or make df, and I have this inside of a response, and it's going to return pandas or PD as we're calling it now, data frame. And then we want the data object. That's the object that contains the actual tweets and related information inside of here. And then from here, we have this data frame, which has the language, text, ID, and created at. So we got to like see it and we're like, okay, cool. We're starting to see how this can be a spreadsheet, right? And then from here, we're like, okay, cool. So we need to authenticate to Google. Cool. So we have the scope is equal to the second API, that's the Google API for feeds. And that's the spreadsheets one, because we're like, yo, we're just doing spreadsheets. Earlier versions of this code actually had like the Drive API, but that's too much. Like, we don't need that. So we only need the scope to be equal to the feeds for spreadsheets. Cool. And then I have inside my downloads file a folder cred new.json, and that's my Google, all my passwords and everything. And then I'm passing in the scope that we just defined, and it's going to return my credentials. So cool. The credentials is where we're going to authenticate to Google. And then GC is where we use the Google spread to authorize with the credentials. And then from here, we're going to call the workbook, which is open by key. And you're like, yo, Jess, like, where are you getting that from? Like, where is that coming from? And isn't that like a crazy like secret? It's not. It's actually just that. That is literally where it's coming from. I just took that right before this, cut and pasted it in, and then was like, okay, cool. We're going to do that. And actually, something kind of cool is if you see this, you'll see that this is shared with some people. And you're like, wait, what? Like, who is this shared with? It's shared with my colleague, and it's shared with the one that I used for stream, and it's shared with this like NC example, just for, I forgot what NC even stands for. I think new code or something. I don't know. I don't remember anymore. That's why you should be more descriptive when naming things. But yeah, these are service accounts that have access to update the API. And we'll get to see which one is updating in a few minutes. So from here, we can actually start to run. And then also it's going to update the worksheet testing. So we have this testing here. It's going to update that. And then from there, it does sheet.update starting with A1, and it just takes the data frame columns and values, and we'll update from there. Cool. And then we get how many rows it's updated and everything. So now from here, we can actually see that we have everything inside the spreadsheet. And then let's take a look at the last edit, who updated it. Oh, it couldn't load the user, but it was one of the service accounts. So yeah, that's a little bit about demo. And then there were a couple. Are tweet IDs sequentially generated? Yes and no. And it really does depend. We have a whole system, and I can go into it for a long time. Do credentials have a timeout? In some cases, yes. It depends on the API that you're using.
Some APIs don't even require credentials, so.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, I used to use the NASA APIs, which like, if you just type in demo key, it will start like making calls.
I was trying to get like notifications for when vaccines are available. And I looked at HEB's website. And if you just like, you load their website and you hit F12, you can kind of see what requests are being sent in the background. And you can see they have a lot of the stuff they do actually is very cleanly organized into public APIs. So then you can just make a GET request to like heb.com/vaccine/ with something or other, and then you get a JSON dump with all the locations that have vaccines. Yeah, and then you can tie in with I don't know, tweet it out or something if you wanted to tie in the Twitter API that, oh, this place has vaccines.
Yeah, so actually I talked yesterday, I had like a one-on-one with a developer who made TurboVax. He was basically just using like the Twitter post and some Ruby and doing something very similar, using like a public API and then posting vaccines that are available. which I thought was really cool. And I could send you a New York Times article on him too, but I got to talk to him yesterday and I was like, oh, that's super cool. And then on the flip side, there was somebody who like is doing the opposite, where she's doing it super manually and was like, I want to automate this more. How do I do that? And I talked to her today as well too. So yeah, that would be really cool to see something like that for Texas. I don't know if I've seen anything like that, or even locally too. That'd be awesome.
Yeah. It's pretty neat. Yeah, like she said, APIs are everywhere.
Yeah, so there does seem to be some questions. I'm going to go through and try to make sure that I answer all the ones. Do credentials have a timeout depending on the API? Yeah, in some cases they will. Sorry, reading documentation is super important, and like to like take a look at that. Is there a limit of API usage? Yes and no. It depends. Like a lot of times, like we have rate limits. We don't want you using it too much. It'll depend by API. Also, there are some ethical concerns that you want to think about depending on like APIs that you're doing, and like sharing personal data, and like using it in conjunction with other data sources as well could be something that you want to think about in terms of like API design, and like if you are making decisions and like creating projects and things like that. Cool. Well, thank you so much for having me. Y'all seem great. Also, if you build anything with the Twitter API, please let me know. I might have a couple of other slides. Yeah, conclusion and Q&A. I just did that, but you could always reach me at jgarrison@twitter.com. Do you build anything using APIs? I want to hear about it. If you make anything cool for Rowdy Hacks, I also want to hear about it. And I'm on Twitter at Jessica Garrison. So I hope to see y'all around.